The U.S. Justice Department has confirmed to Al Jazeera that Attorney General Jeff Sessions was questioned last week over alleged collusion between Donald Trump's presidential campaign and Russia. It's believed to be the first time a member of President Trump's cabinet has been questioned in the inquiry. Our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, reports.
Getting closer to the president. The Department of Justice confirming Attorney General Jeff Sessions has been interviewed by Robert Mueller's team as a witness in the Russia investigation. It's the first time a member of Donald Trump's cabinet has been questioned by the special counsel. But Trump says he's unfazed by what Sessions might have told investigators.
I'm not at all concerned. Thank you all.
The investigation is probing possible Trump campaign ties with Russia and whether the United States president tried to obstruct the Russia investigation. As the head of Trump's foreign policy team during the 2016 presidential campaign, Sessions has unique insights, given he was also involved deeply in the firing of the former FBI director, James Comey. In tweets and publicly, Trump has complained bitterly that Sessions recused himself from overseeing the investigation.
I am disappointed.
Believing Sessions should have done more to protect him. Sessions is one of more than a dozen current and former Trump officials to be questioned. Earlier this month, it was revealed one-time Trump strategist Steve Bannon has also struck a deal with Mueller's team to be interviewed. Late last year, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and advisor George Papadopoulos pled guilty to charges in connection with the probe and are now cooperating as witnesses. It suggests Mueller is ratcheting up pressure on the president, who has been cryptic about whether he will speak with the special counsel.
We'll see what happens.
And despite claims by Donald Trump's lawyer that the Russia investigation would wrap up by the end of last year, the questions by the special counsel continue and appear to be intensifying. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Okay, let's bring in Bruce Fein in Washington, D.C. He's a former U.S. Associate Deputy Attorney General. Thank you very much for being with us. What was more significant, do you think, the fact that Sessions was questioned or the questions that he was asked?
Well, the questions that he was asked, this is not the first time that a cabinet minister has undergone questioning. I remember during Iran-Contra, we had Secretary of Defense Weinberger, Secretary of State George Shultz were asked questions not only by the Congress but by Lawrence Walsh, the independent counsel at that time. So that's not what's novel. It seemed clear from the questions that Mr. Mueller is focusing on obstruction of justice, that he would be asking Mr. Sessions about the call that the White House counsel, Mr. McGahn, had made over to Mr. Sessions protesting his recusal and insisting that he needed to stay there, in the president's words, because he needed to be protected, just like other attorneys generals protected President Obama or President Kennedy. Well, if you need protection, it suggests you've done something wrong. We also know that Mr. Sessions was involved with the decision to fire Mr. Comey. And during a Senate Intelligence Committee oversight hearing, he refused to answer what communications he had with the president. That kind of privilege would not obtain with regard to Mr. Mueller. And the president himself has indicated that he was firing Mr. Comey, not because of ineptitude, but because this investigation of possible Russian collusion was causing him a big headache. Well, that clearly is obstruction of justice by any manner of characterization. You're trying to destroy the person who's investigating you, not because he's inept, but because he's getting closer and irritating you for your own personal worries. We have another element here that comes into play, and that is the collusion itself, where Mr. Sessions was present when Mr. Papadopoulos was raising the issue of having Mr. Trump meet with President Putin of Russia during the campaign. So it's obviously they'll try to determine whether or not maybe approaches were made, even if they didn't succeed, and having Mr. Putin directly or indirectly assisting the campaign. And that's something that Mr. Sessions, being head of being at the top of the food chain, if you will, in the campaign strategy, and having spoken to the Russian ambassador on many occasions, would know about that. My own experience in Washington means that I think the obstruction of justice is the greater vulnerability of Mr. Trump. As we know his attitude, he needs to strike back and seek retribution against anybody who's upsetting him, and that could leave him off a cliff because this isn't the only piece of evidence that suggests that he was obstructing justice. He had communicated with his son, Donald Jr., about what kind of explanation he should provide that was misleading about the meeting last June with the Russians, who promised in advance of the meeting to hand over information adverse to Hillary Clinton. And that also would indicate that he was participating in an effort to might mislead what perhaps the evidence showed with regard to collusion. So it's a very important interview that was had, and I think it clearly is looking towards Mr. Mueller asking to interview and speak with Mr. Trump himself.
Mr. Fine, let me just interrupt very briefly, because you raise an interesting point. I mean, also given the fact that Donald Trump has said that he's not bothered by the fact that Mr. Sessions has appeared in front of Mr. Mueller in the investigation, but relations between Sessions and Trump have not been good. Should the president be worried, briefly?
Yes, he should be, because he has criticized, ridiculed Mr. Sessions in public. Mr. Sessions, he was once so disappointed, he offered his resignation. So Mr. Trump cannot expect that Mr. Sessions is going to fall on his sword with him. And he will, in my judgment, protect himself and characterize the communications and the intent in a way that will exonerate Mr. Sessions, even if it implicates Mr. Trump. And this is a problem that Mr. Trump has, I think, elsewhere. He's alienated so many, including Mr. Bannon and others, that they have no incentive where you have some ambiguity to interpret them in a way that's favorable to the president. That could come back to haunt him very much.
Bruce Fine, thank you very much indeed for your time.